Hello, and welcome to this general overview of proposals. Uh, it's broadly applicable to many proposals in various professional contexts, and particularly those involving a technical project of some sort. I want to preface this by saying that this lesson is going to be much broader than any proposal that you might be asked to write in our class for an assignment. So always go by the instructions for that. But I want to step back and give a sort of broad lay of the land, if you will, so that you have that general context. Proposals span a very, very vast range of uh, of different kinds, and they arise in so many different contexts and vary by so many different factors. So I want to kind of go through and give some flavor for the ways they can differ and the different characteristics they can entail. So first, solicited versus unsolicited. So uh, it could be that you just have an idea, you go to your manager or the higher ups in your organization, and you just take the initiative to ask if you can propose something. That may involve varying levels of formality. They may say, sure, prepare a presentation, we'll set up a meeting, or sure, write up a memo and send it to so and so. It could also be that your organization has some sort of structured process in place where they formally invite proposals as long as they fit within certain parameters. Or it could be that you're applying to a grant agency, like a federal government agency that gives grants for large sums of money in response to well drafted, lengthy, detailed proposals. That would be both solicited and quite formal in that case. So uh, there there's differences on that level. Sometimes a formal invitation for a proposal that goes through a very structured process is sometimes referred to as an RFP, request for proposals. There's a couple other abbreviations in similar vein. Sometimes it's even called literally a solicitation. I sort of touched on the internal versus external there, but as I said, it could be within your organization, it could be outside your organization, whether it's a grant agency or perhaps a client or a potential client that you want to propose an idea to. There's any number of possibilities on that front as well. Proposals also differ in what's being sought. So, in the example I mentioned, where you're seeking a large sum of money from a government agency, it's primarily money that you're looking for there. Uh, a lot of times with internal proposals, what you're seeking is permission or authorization. And if you're seeking permission to work on a certain project or to have a team of people work with you on a certain project, there may be money involved with that, but indirectly there always is, in the sense that your time is your company's money. So these things can be somewhat integrated, even if you're not explicitly asking for money. Uh, there's also a lot of variation by formats. So I mentioned earlier how uh, your organization might ask you to put together a presentation for if you have a proposal idea. Sometimes they're very informal, where you don't have slides. It may be extemporaneous. So it's you know it's maybe in a very broad, loose sense, a proposal if you think about the elevator pitch type of situation. But those should be really thought of as a bridge. You're just trying to get to the next meeting so that you can do more of the things that we're going to talk about here. Uh, on the written side of things, it could be, as I mentioned earlier, a memorandum that you have uh, that you have wide discretion to craft, or it could be that you've been given a certain structure you're supposed to follow. This kind of ties in to the next bullet point, so I'm just going to jump to that, which is the format. The degree of flexibility varies a lot. Now, memos tend to be more flexible, so if somebody asks for a proposal in that format, then you have a lot of discretion in how you craft that in most cases. On the other hand, you could have a very strict, detailed list of sections. Sometimes they even tell you what each section must be titled. Sometimes they tell you how much space can be devoted to a given section. Sometimes the space restrictions are just in the aggregate, and then it's up to you how to allocate that space among sections. And then in between, you have sort of loosely guided solicitations where they say, yeah, make sure you address these points, but it's largely up to you how to structure your headings and subheadings and things like that. So uh, there's also variation in terms of flexibility for the content. So sometimes it's wide open what you ask for. Sometimes a particular organization or agency might have a wide range of things they're open to considering as long as you make a good case. Other times, there is a very narrow mission or a very defined range of what they are willing and able to fund. And again, this could be whether it's internal or external. Sometimes your company may say, we're only willing to entertain projects that really stick within our current strategic vision for the organization. Other times, you may be in a company where they have a more flexible approach to what direction they may be willing to consider going in. Uh, there's also some difference in whether you have discretion to leave certain details for later and say, here are some broad strokes for these different aspects, but I don't have enough visibility on some of the specifics yet, and so I want to come back and see if I can kind of flesh this out later. That will be a little bit more common in multi-stage proposals. So if you have a multi-stage project where they're only going to commit to a certain amount to start with, and then as you get a little bit more visibility for what the next stage might look like, you're expected to flesh out more detail, and then you propose to go on to the next stage. So there tends to be a correlation there, but not necessarily. Sometimes you have sometimes you're expected to kind of pre-plan with as much detail as possible something that is fairly extensive, and you just have to do your best. But in that case, you need to look into how much discretion there could be to change. Do you have to ask permission to change if you encounter an unforeseen circumstance in those situations? So there's just various sorts of differences in terms of the content for what it is you're proposing to do. When we introduced technical communication in general, we talked about how two twin considerations as you approach most areas of TechCom are audience and purpose. And we talked about how audiences vary tremendously based on education, experience, whether they're internal or external, how closely you work with them, what their motivation is, what their background is, how familiar they are with a particular project already, any number of factors. In a proposal, your audience could be, as I said before, an immediate supervisor, some higher ups, and various possible external agencies, and sometimes a combination of these. So you need to be mindful of how to take into account the audiences that are in play here. Sometimes when you're submitting to a particular agency, you have the benefit of knowing that it's going to go to a panel of experts in your field, but they may not be exactly in your field, so you have to do a little bit of research to get a sense of how much familiarity they're likely to have with your particular area. And you may not always know exactly who they are. This is another factor. Sometimes, in the case of some proposals that are anonymously reviewed, it may be by design that you actually never get to know the specific individuals. And so you have to kind of factor that into your decision making as well as you can. On the purpose side, we talked about how, in general, our purpose in technical communication usually has something to do with problem solving. It usually kind of centers around problem solution, particularly on the engineering side. And when and in support of that, we typically end up having to do some combination of informing and persuading. And usually one is primary for a given genre. And with proposals, persuasion, of course, as you might expect, is the primary goal, and more specifically to persuade so as to be able to obtain the money or permission or authorization that you seek. As I point out here on the bottom, we are going to have to inform as needed to support the case that we're making in a way that weaves in whatever information is necessary. And there may be certain sections that are primarily informative, even though as a whole the document is primarily persuasive. Now, in between, I kind of skipped over something here because I wanted to make that general point about the interplay between persuasion and informing. But in support of your overall argument that you should grant me what I'm seeking, there are typical sub-arguments. So these typically tend to involve some variation of the problem I'm looking to solve is important, I have a good plan to solve it, and I can solve it. I can do that plan. All right. So I'll come back to these three arguments, but I just kind of want you to keep those in mind. We have an important need, I have a good plan to solve it, and I can execute that plan if you give me what I'm asking. So this is a list of some common items that need to be addressed one way or another. Now, some of these may be more explicit than others, and there may be additional ones besides these that are also in support of these core three arguments that support your overarching argument that they should grant your proposal. So if you think about it, these tend to support one or more of those three core arguments. So the first couple there, what's the problem and why should the audience care? What's already been done and what may be still lacking? Where might there be room for improvement? So those both kind of go to the heart of this first one. X is an important problem, kind of helps bolster that. these next couple, what do you want to do and how? Does the plan make sense? How much will it cost? How much time will it take? Do those make sense? Well, those kind of relate to this middle one here. I have a good plan to help solve it, right? So these are putting meat on the bones, if you will, of that. Now, I also want to point out that these are in the context of each other. So, the appropriate cost and the appropriate time is interpreted through the prism of what you want to do and how you want to do it. And there are times where one is sort of driving the other and vice versa. So let me elaborate a bit. Uh, there are times when the entity you're proposing to is really, really concerned about having a problem solved. There's great urgency, great motivation to solve the problem, right? So back to audience, right? So if we're dealing with that kind of audience and circumstance, it may be that that entity is also flexible on the budget, maybe less flexible on the timing if there's great urgency, but potentially flexible on the timing too. If you can make a case that your plan, however much it may cost, however long it may take, your plan does solve their problem. Uh, and it solves their problem better than any alternatives available at the moment. So if you can make that case, there may be flexibility on the cost and even the timeline. But there are other situations where it's almost the converse. So there are a lot of more bureaucratic situations where there's very rigid caps on how long you're allowed to take and or how much you're allowed to ask for. But within those rigid parameters, there may be a lot of flexibility to consider a range of good ideas, right? So it could be that, hey, if you got some reasonable idea, it may not have to be the best we've ever heard, but if it fits within these parameters, we'll consider it. And sometimes they may fund a wide range of similar ideas just to see which one percolates up with the best results over time. So it really matters what your context is when deciding how to frame your argument for cost and your plan, and which one to make sure fits within the other, right? Because if an agency has a rigid rule, it can't cost more than X, then don't waste your time making a case how, oh, if you would only go a little bit more than X, we'd have the best plan in the world. Because if they can't consider that, you're just wasting all your great rhetorical skill. On the other hand, if you know that a particular entity is desperate to solve a problem and they just want the best approach and they have flexibility on other things, don't don't skimp. Don't 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 try to be cheaper if that's not what their concern is, right? Don't try to claim you could rush it if that's not their concern. So these things all have to be interpreted in light of each other. Um, what difference will it make and for whom? So this is kind of a blended question. It kind of goes to both the importance of the problem and the merits of your solution, right? Are you the right person or team to do it? Well, this pretty squarely hits that third point of we can do the job. We can do what we're proposing to do. And then this last one, how will the results be evaluated uh, to determine how successful you were? So this kind of could be thought of as a blend of the second two, because you have to have a good plan that is susceptible to being assessed in terms of how successful it is, and you have um, be able to make the case that when you're talking about you can do it, how it is that um, that you plan to support that by having some way of establishing whether you in fact did it or not. I put why here, and this is to remind me to say that it's not always readily apparent what the best way is to define success. So you may have to justify this. And this the level of justification that you have to provide for any one of these questions is going to depend on the situation. Some things are some cases are going to be more readily accepted than others, but be prepared to have to justify why your standard for what should be considered successful is the right one and makes sense. On that point, I want to circle back to this first bullet point and just mention that a lot of novice proposal writers make the mistake of assuming that their audience cares about, as much about the problem as they do. Uh, Sometimes they're inclined to agree with you right off the bat that the problem is every bit as important as you think it is. Other times, that's not the case, and you'd be surprised how often people just assume it's a given and they gloss over that and they dive right into their solution. This has to be approached with care because especially when you have mixed audiences, especially when you may have an unknown audience, you just can't afford uh, to risk losing them right from the beginning by having them be like, yeah, 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 everything they say is great, but I don't care. Now, there may be times, particularly in an internal context, where you have good reason to know that that doesn't need as much attention. But just make sure that you're thinking about all these. There's no, again, no formula. There's no magic formula for knowing how much emphasis to give each of these. It's got to be crafted with judgment, case by case. But just make sure you're mindful of all these factors. Um, all right, let's go to the last thing I wanted to touch on, which is to cite some general reasons why proposals get rejected, particularly the most common reasons. Now, this is only according to one study, but we're not nitpicking the exact numbers here. I just wanted to highlight the tremendous disparity between all three of these and everything else. So literally more than half of proposals that get rejected for one or more of these three reasons. And all others combined are 16%. So the if you think about it, now this is the particular language that's used in a lot of major grant funding agencies. So that can vary somewhat depending on your situation. But if you think about it, so problem significance, that sounds a lot like importance of the problem, right? And approach sounds a lot like a good plan. And investigators is basically academic ease for the team, the people doing it. So the team, I or we can do it. So these three things really align with these three sub arguments that I highlighted before, which is a big part of the reason why I highlighted them. But this really affirms, I think, the importance of kind of viewing this overarching argument through the prism of these three sub arguments, and then these questions. There's different ways that people maybe break down, frame, subdivide, or add to this list of questions. But these are basically questions to help flesh out or make sure you're adequately addressing those three core constituent arguments of your overarching argument. So I just kind of wanted to end on that note. I also just want to briefly point out what's not on here. What's not on here is how cool or interesting your idea or technology is. Because that by itself is not what the reviewers or the evaluators are going to care about. Again, it may be something that's really interesting to you, but and it may be really interesting on its merits, right? The reviewers may read it and be, wow, that's really cool, interesting technology. But I don't see the connection to why I should give them what they're asking for, right? So it's important to make sure that you don't just talk about what's cool or interesting unless there's a clear, direct connection to the actual argument that you need to make. All right. Hope this has been helpful. And remember what I said at the beginning, which is that this is much broader than any particular assignment you may have in our class. So always go by the instructions in that case, just like you would for any other proposal you encounter. This was meant to be a broad survey of proposals in general. So with that, I'll thank you for watching and see you next time. Bye.